feel like if I haven't read all of these, I can't really call myself a booktuber anymore. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today we are going to wrap up my autumn TBR. So recently I have started setting seasonal TBRs where I put aside all of the books I want to read during a specific season of the year. I started it in summer with 10 books on the TBR and I only read 7 of them. So I decided if I'm only reading 7, maybe that's what I should focus on. So I have put 7 books aside this autumn and now we're going to see if I've actually read them. There are 2 books from this on ebook and the rest of them were all physical copies. So let's see how I got on. Book number 1 that I'm going to talk about is After the Silence by Louise O'Neill. And Louise is one of my auto-buy authors and I really love everything that she has written so far. This was a copy that I actually got from NetGalley. I really enjoyed this. I think this would have been a good read to have in the kind of lead up to Halloween, maybe mid to late October, because it's kind of a thriller book where you follow the events of Inishrune, which is an island off the coast of West Cork, and there was a murder in the community about 10 years before the book takes place. And you do have kind of dual timelines where some of the action does take place in those 10 years before. There's a party at the Kinsella house and the next morning there's a body found on the premises. And then you come in 10 years later and there's an Australian company have come to Inishrune and now they're making a documentary about the murder and they're interviewing people from around the island and also the Kinsellas themselves who still own the house where the murder took place. And it is known that there was a murder. It is known that this woman was murdered. So you're trying to find out what happened to Nessa and who was the murderer. And I will admit, throughout this entire book, I had absolutely no idea who had done it. I did have ideas in my head as to who it could have been. And I was trying to piece it together. But I was so blown away by the reveal of who it actually was. I'm not going to tell you who it is because that will defeat the entire purpose of reading the book. But I will just say it's not somebody you would expect it to be. And as well as that, in kind of tandem with that, there is also a kind of a subplot about domestic abuse and not just physical abuse, but also emotional abuse, gaslighting, that kind of a situation. And it's very prevalent in 2 relationships that Keelan has been throughout her life. First of all, that with the father of her son, Alex, and now with her current husband, Henry. And you really notice the effects that gaslighting and emotional abuse will have on a person, especially when Keelan is somebody who had worked in domestic abuse helplines before. I felt like that was dealt with really well, and it's something that Louise had obviously done quite a lot of research into because it is dealt with in such a well done manner. Overall, I gave this book 3.5 stars, and the reason that I knocked off 1.5 is because I found it really hard to get into at the start. I don't know what it was. I don't know if there's anybody else in the book community who has found it difficult to get into at the start, but I think it took me maybe 25-30% to actually really get into the gritty books that I was expecting. And I think because of that, it just took me a little bit longer to gel with it than I was expecting to. So it was still a really great book, and it is something that I will still recommend to everybody to read. It just needed a bit of something at the start. And so the second ebook was also from NetGalley, and it is The Education of Ivy Edwards by Hannah Tovey. I really wish I could say I like this one. I really do, but I just did not like this. I think what happened is that I fell victim to the blurb. I was expecting something very different to what the book actually was. So Ivy is working in London and her job isn't really what she wants to do, and she's not really performing as well as she should be or that she could be. And she also has quite a lot of friends who are heavy drinkers, heavy drug takers. I would say they're really bad influences on Ivy. But you also have her life back in Wales where she has her mother and her father, and her grandfather is also still in her life. And they have a very close relationship, which is something that I really loved reading because I also had a very close relationship with my grandparents. I think from this book, I was kind of expecting something like Bridget Jones meets Eat, Pray, Love, where she's kind of not really happy with her life, living in London, has all of her friends around her, goes out on these dates and that kind of a thing, but also goes on like this kind of a journey to improve her life and to get a little bit happier with her situation. And that's something that just didn't happen. There wasn't really a moment where she's like, this isn't what I want to do, until you get to like 80% into the book, which I felt was a little bit too late for me. I really, really wanted to love this book, but her friends really, really annoyed me. I don't like reading about heavy drug use. I'm kind of a prude in that sense, in that I don't condone heavy drug use. So reading about it did make me feel kind of on the fence about the book anyway, but there was quite a lot of things about the book that just didn't work for me, and I did end up giving this one a 2 stars. So let's move on now to the physical books. And one of them that I read and finished and actually really enjoyed more than I thought that I would is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. I had never read a Stephen King book before this year, but this is a copy that I borrowed from a friend of mine, and I knew that I wanted to give it back to her soon, but I didn't know if I was going to give it back to her as something that I had not read, something that I had read and abandoned, or something that I had completely read through. I decided to just read it. I decided to just pick it up and give it a try. And I really, really enjoyed it. I have got a reading vlog all about my experiences reading with this book. I'm going to put it up there and I'm going to put it in the description. So if you want to check out what my thoughts on this are in a little bit more detail, you can go and head there. But I did really enjoy this book. It's not very gory, so I think it was a very good place for me to start in terms of Stephen King's books, because gore is not my kind of thing. I really do not like gore. I don't like horror. I don't like books with a lot of violence in it. So this was a run that I think was a good place to start, because it's kind of more of a psychological book. It's about a time traveler who goes back in time to prevent the assassination of JFK. And he's trying to prevent the assassination of JFK to kind of cause a butterfly effect and see if that's going to improve the world as we know it now, because the aftermath of JFK's assassination didn't happen. And when he goes back, he falls in love with somebody and he kind of builds his own life in kind of the areas around Texas near Dallas where the assassination happened. And you find out what kind of happens as a butterfly effect, because he does go back and come back to our timeline a couple of times, and things have changed significantly when he comes back to present day. So it's definitely a book that I would recommend if you're trying to get into Stephen King, but you're not a big gore lover. Next on the list is one that you will recognize from my summer TBR. And I said, if I didn't read it by autumn, it had to go. Though so many people loved it that I know, 2 people that I know personally have loved it. So I said, look, I'm going to give it a try. Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. Again, like After the Silence, this took me a little while to get into. It took me maybe 50 to 100 pages to actually get into the story, but when I got in, I was hooked. So this is about a girl called Kaya, and she grows up in like this marsh area in North Carolina, and her family have all kind of deserted her. They've all kind of moved away. And one day in 1969, there is a murder, and she is one of the primal suspects because the town hates her, and it's just easy to pin it on somebody. And you see how she grew up, what her situation was like when she was growing up, what it was like for her to grow up kind of out in the marshes, very isolated, very socially unaware. And she meets some friends along the way. She makes very good friends with a couple of people in the town. And then you see the court case after the murder happens and how she's involved in that. I don't know if this murder needed to be part of the plot. I think the book was strong enough as its own without the murder plot. And Kaya's story was strong enough without the murder plot as well. Like, she didn't need to have any kind of murder plot put into it as a kind of a B plot. I think it would have been really interesting to read about Kaya and her life on the marshes, and her whole life story would have made a really interesting book itself. But that said, I still really enjoyed this one. Even with the kind of slow start that I had with this, ended up giving it 4 stars, and I would definitely recommend this book. So the next finished book is The Falling in Love Montage by Kira Smith, and I really enjoyed this one. I think the main reason I put it on my autumn TBR is because of the cover. But the content itself doesn't really add up to autumn in that it takes place in the summer after our main character Saoirse does her leaving cert. So those are your school exams for leaving school when you are in Ireland. You take them when you're like 17, 18, 19. And they take place in June and you get your results in mid-August kind of time. So it kind of runs through the summer when Saoirse has sat her exams, and it runs throughout the summer after that. And there's a girl who moved to the area named Ruby, and Saoirse really falls for her. Like, I think it's kind of a love at first sight trope, but she's not really letting herself admit that this is what she's feeling for this girl. I also really enjoyed the fact that there is something a little bit deeper in this book that I wasn't expecting. And it is that Saoirse's mother suffers from early onset dementia. And she is living in a kind of a care home. She has carers looking after her 24/7 because she needs that level of care. And Saoirse is kind of struggling to cope with that, but also struggling to cope with her father having fallen in love with somebody else and moving another person into the house and them getting married. It's a lot deeper than I was expecting it to be. That was something that really, really endeared me to this book. But something that I think I had confused myself with is the setting of this book. So I had somehow gotten it into my head that this was set in Northern Ireland, and I think I had imagined that it was set in Belfast specifically. But having read this book, there is mention of the leaving cert, and there is mention of doing Irish classes, and there's mentions of things that you would be familiar with when you grew up in the Republic. So I think it is set somewhere in the Republic of Ireland, but there isn't a mention as to where specifically that is. All of that said, all of that in thoughts, I ended up giving this one a 4-star. I absolutely loved this book. And so we are on to the confessions part, because there are 2 books that I put onto this TBR and then did not end up reading. And that is The Vanishing Half by Britt Brennan and There's Something About Sweetie by Sandia Menon. The reason that I didn't read There's Something About Sweetie is because I want to kind of reread When Dimple Met Rishi before I get to this one. I know they're not, like, it's not a sequel to When Dimple Met Rishi, but I would also like to read it because they're kind of a companion novel, so you're going to notice people from When Dimple Met Rishi throughout this book, and I would like to be able to recognize them a little bit more clearly because I've just read When Dimple Met Rishi before going into this one. Why didn't I read The Vanishing Half? I have absolutely no idea. I think I just never picked it up. So I am going to put this on a TBR in the future, and I am going to read it because it genuinely sounds like such a good book, and a lot of people that I've seen who have read this have really, really enjoyed it. I just really need to give myself that little kick up the hole and actually do it. There we go. That's my autumn TBR wrap up. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.